Story 1. The Room That Stayed Silent. I had been driving for hours along the winding roads of the Blue Ridge, the trees thick and suffocating, their shadows stretching across the narrow asphalt like dark fingers. Night had fallen earlier than I expected, and the sun had vanished behind the ridges hours ago, leaving only the dull glow of my headlights and the occasional flash of reflective road markers. My eyes were heavy, and every curve in the road seemed sharper, every shadow more deliberate. That's when I saw it, a neon motel sign, flickering, buzzing, its electric hum cutting through the quiet of the ridge. It wasn't much, just a weathered building, peeling paint, and a parking lot cracked with age. But the light promised a place to rest, and I desperately needed one. I pulled into the lot slowly, my tires crunching over gravel, and parked near the office. The neon cast intermittent red and green streaks across the asphalt, highlighting the weeds sprouting through the cracks, the rusted metal of an old vending machine. I hesitated before going inside. The air smelled of wet earth and gasoline, like the world beyond the asphalt had bled into the building itself. The door to the office swung open with a groan. The clerk was there, hunched over the counter, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and eyes that darted away from mine the instant I entered. He didn't greet me, didn't ask my name, just muttered something I barely caught and slid a key across the counter. The key was cold in my hand, heavy with age. The hallway leading to my room smelled of damp carpet, the musty, heavy kind that sticks to your skin. The door to my room creaked as I opened it, and the air inside was thick with old smoke, the faint lingering scent of someone who had slept there long ago, and perhaps never left entirely. I set my bag down on the sagging bed and tried to unpack, but every sound outside the room seemed to exaggerate itself. The floorboards in the hall creaked sharply. A distant car engine roared and then vanished, and at moments I was certain I could hear the scrape of nails or the soft shuffle of feet. My pulse quickened with each unexplained sound, though part of me told myself it was just exhaustion, my mind playing tricks. I tried to sleep, curling up beneath the thin blanket, willing myself to ignore the small, subtle noises. I could feel the room settling around me, the walls sighing, the pipes groaning in protest, the old building stretching itself after a long day. And yet, the silence in that room felt alive, pressing against me in waves. Hours must have passed, though I can't be certain, because when I woke, the clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m. I froze. The room was pitch black, but there was a sensation, a presence, so insistent that my chest tightened. I could hear it, or at least I thought I could. Faint, deliberate breathing, shallow and uneven, coming from the corner of the room opposite the bed. I flipped the light switch with a trembling hand, expecting, fearing to see someone standing there, but the corner was empty. The shadows pooled into the edges of the room, curling into shapes that were almost familiar. I rubbed my eyes, certain that exhaustion was tricking me, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I felt drawn toward the window, peering out into the night. The parking lot was empty except for a single, motionless car beneath the flickering neon, and no figure walked the lot. Still, the weight of that silent presence pressed against me like a tangible thing, a cold, suffocating blanket. I left the light on and tried to return to bed, though sleep would not come. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracks of the window felt amplified. I could hear the rustle of the curtain, the tick of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of electricity running through the neon outside. Each sound felt deliberate, as if the building itself was aware of me, aware of the sudden intrusion of life into its long, hollow history. My thoughts spiraled, bouncing between logic and instinct. There was nothing there, I kept telling myself, nothing at all. And yet, the feeling persisted, crawling across my skin, tugging at my gaze, coaxing me toward the corner where the breathing had come from. By dawn, I had packed my things silently, avoiding even a glance at the shadows that seemed to gather in the corners when I wasn't looking. I stepped into the hallway, my boots echoing unnaturally on the old floorboards, and made my way back to the office. The clerk had vanished, leaving the counter bare and silent. The neon sign outside flickered for a final moment before going dark, leaving the parking lot in the soft, grey light of early morning. I drove away slowly, glancing in the rear view mirror at the motel as it receded into the ridges. It felt impossibly still, as if it had never been disturbed, as if I had been nothing more than a whisper passing through its corridors. Even now, thinking back on that night, I can't fully explain it. The memory carries a pressure in my chest, a lingering weight in my bones. I remember the way the silence seemed alive, thick enough to choke on, pressing against my ears with every small, mundane noise. The motel, the room, the shadows, they weren't overtly threatening, and yet the feeling of being watched, of something old and patient lying just beyond perception, is unforgettable. Every time I imagine those walls, the damp carpet, the stagnant air, I feel that same subtle dread creeping back, not in a sharp, sudden way, but as a quiet, insistent weight, like the world itself is holding its breath. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I know I will never truly forget that night, or the room that stayed silent, waiting. Story 2 echoes from the vacancy sign. I had been driving since late morning, the roads twisting through the Blue Ridge like veins carved into the hills. By the time night fell, the forest had closed in completely, leaving only the faint glow of my headlights to cut through the darkness. My eyes were burning from fatigue, and every curve of the road felt sharper than the last. That's when I saw it, a flickering motel sign, the word vacancy pulsing in uneven, harsh red. Something about it felt off, like the sign itself was warning me to turn back, but I didn't. I was too tired, too desperate to care. I turned into the gravel lot, the tires crunching sharply in the silence of the ridge, and pulled up near the office. The building sagged in on itself, paint peeling and faded from years of neglect, but the door opened with ease, and I stepped inside, expecting a quick check-in and a bed for the night. The clerk barely looked at me. He was an older man, hunched, with hollowed eyes that seemed to avoid mine entirely. He muttered a price, pointed toward a room at the end of the hall, and handed me a key. I followed the hallway's uneven carpeting, the fluorescent lights buzzing and flickering above me. The room itself was tidier than I'd expected, almost unnervingly so, but the air carried a metallic scent that made the back of my throat tighten. It wasn't strong, not like fresh blood, but old, stale, settled into the walls, lingering like something the building had absorbed over decades. I set my bag down, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, listening. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of electricity from the flickering hallway light, the occasional creak from the old floorboards. Then it began, the knocks. At first, I assumed a neighbour, maybe someone returning from the road outside. But the pattern didn't match any kind of door-to-door rhythm. There was a pause, then a thump somewhere along the hall, closer now, then further away, moving in ways that didn't make sense. I told myself it was my imagination, that the building was settling, or perhaps a storm far off, rattling some loose shutter. But then came the whispers, soft, low, fractured, coming from outside my door, blending into the knocks. I couldn't make out words, only tones, anger, despair, pleading. My stomach twisted, and I pulled the covers up around my shoulders, trying to convince myself it was just tired ears mishearing the natural creaks and groans of an old building. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't be sure. The knocks grew more deliberate, the whispers more insistent. I could feel them crawling along the walls, moving closer to me. Even though I was certain I hadn't left the bed, my pulse pounded, every muscle tense, my eyes tracing the corners of the room where shadows seemed to gather. Then I realized it wasn't outside at all. The sounds were coming from inside the walls themselves, like some presence embedded within the building, waiting. I could hear it shift slightly with each exhale of my own breath, and every instinct screamed at me to leave. Yet my body felt rooted to the mattress, caught between disbelief and raw fear. I tried reasoning it out. Maybe an animal had made its way into the walls. Rats, squirrels, anything. But the rhythms of the noises didn't match anything natural. They weren't random. They had intent, like someone or something was trying to communicate or warn. I could hear a soft scratching, as if fingernails or claws scraped along the plaster. My chest tightened, and my hands shook as I reached for my bag, dragging it across the floor. Every movement felt loud, exaggerated, like the building was magnifying my presence and judging it. I could hear the whispers peak, a crescendo of sorrow and anger, and I knew I couldn't stay another moment. I opened the door to the hall, expecting maybe the lobby, someone to explain, a rational voice, but the hallway stretched into stillness, the flickering lights above accentuating the shadows in uneven ways. I didn't look for the clerk. I didn't want to. I ran down the hall, the carpet muffling my steps as best it could, the knocks and whispers following me, echoing in ways that felt impossible. I burst out into the gravel lot, the cold night air slapping my face, and ran to my car without looking back. The neon sign flickered one final time before going dark, leaving the motel swallowed by the ridges and the dark forest that surrounded it. I drove as fast as I could without control, the trees lining the road like silent, observing sentinels. I glanced in the rearview mirror several times, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me back through the turns and hills. But there was nothing, only the residual echo of the motel itself, which I could still feel pressing in my mind, even miles away. Every bump, every creak of the car sounded amplified, reminding me of the knocks and whispers that had pursued me through the walls. I couldn't shake it. For weeks after, I would wake in the middle of the night, hearing faint scratching or muttered tones just beyond the walls of my apartment, and the memories of that room would flood back with vivid clarity. Even now, I think about it sometimes, the metallic edge to the air, the way the building itself seemed aware of my presence, aware of my fear. I can still feel the whispering crawl along my spine when I close my eyes, the weight of the silence pressing against me, thicker than any blanket. It wasn't just a motel room. It was a place where something old lingered, patient, watching, embedded in the walls and the air. I've driven that stretch of highway since. But I never stop for another motel, never follow the neon glow into the ridges. There's a lingering dread that the place waits for more travelers, for more people, to mistake a flickering light for a promise of rest. And part of me will always wonder what exactly was trapped in those walls, and whether it was really the building making the noises, or something else entirely, alive and intent, listening. Even recounting it now, I feel that quiet, suffocating pressure in my chest. It's subtle, insistent, like the memory itself is alive, whispering at the edge of thought. I've tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to exhaustion, imagination, or some local superstition, but nothing fits. The motel, the room, the sounds, they exist in my memory as clearly as if I were still standing there, listening. And I know that somewhere out there, along the winding ridge road, that building still stands, waiting for the next person foolish or desperate enough to see the vacancy sign flicker in the night. Story 3, the check-in that never ended. I had been driving the winding roads of the Blue Ridge all day, the kind of roads that make every turn feel sharper than it should, and every hill a slow, breathless climb. Night fell suddenly, darker than I expected, and the forest seemed to close in on the car like a living thing. My eyes were burning and I could feel the tension coiling in my shoulders. Then, through the trees, a neon motel sign flickered in uneven red letters. I slowed down, relief mixing with unease. It wasn't much, just a low, rectangular building set back from the road, paint peeling, and a lot cracked with gravel and weeds. But I needed a place to rest, to shake off the creeping exhaustion. Inside the office, the clerk looked at me in a way that immediately set my teeth on edge. His eyes were too wide, almost unnaturally so, and he asked questions that didn't make sense, as though he was trying to confirm something about me that I couldn't name. I nodded along, fumbling for coherent responses, and he handed me a key without another word. The hallway was dim, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and the air smelled faintly of damp carpet and something older, like the building itself was steeped in decades of stale smoke and long-forgotten occupants. I followed the narrow corridor, counting doors as I went, but when I found the number on my key, the door didn't seem to align with the floor plan I had in my mind. I opened it and stepped inside, and immediately everything felt wrong. The room was tidy, almost sterile in its order, but the corners didn't line up the way they should have, as if the walls themselves had shifted. I set my bag down and tried to close the door, only to find it swinging back open as though pushed by some invisible hand. Footsteps echoed faintly in the hall, soft and deliberate, but when I strained to hear, they didn't match the rhythm of any neighbouring room. I tried to leave, to retrace my steps, but the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long. When I finally reached the parking lot, I realised it looped back to the same sign I had passed earlier. Every exit led me back to the beginning, and my stomach dropped as the sense of being trapped tightened around me. Hours, or maybe it was days, slid by in a blur. Time didn't seem to have meaning. I wandered the halls, trying doors at random, each room similarly tidy but subtly distorted. Some had furniture that wasn't quite the right scale. Others had windows that looked out into nothing but darkness, though the angle suggested they should have faced the parking lot. I began hearing faint murmurs, the low creak of floorboards under invisible feet. I told myself it was exhaustion, the strain of the drive playing tricks on my senses, but the more I tried to convince myself of logic, the more absurdly the building worked against it. At one point, I sat on the edge of a bed in a small room, trying to map out the floor plan in my head, only to realize that each room seemed to shift subtly when I looked away. A doorway would appear wider or narrower than memory suggested. A hallway would seem to elongate or compress, and when I tried to leave, I found myself facing a wall where a door had been just moments ago. I could feel panic rising, but it was muffled, as if the building itself absorbed fear and returned it to me in heavier doses. The air was thick and metallic, pressing in on my lungs, making each breath deliberate and slow. Eventually, I stumbled back toward what I thought was the office. The lights were dim, flickering in the same uneven pattern as before, and the counter sat empty. Not a single movement, not a hint of life. On the counter, the keys were lined up neatly, gleaming in the sickly glow of the overhead lights. It was as if I had never left, as if my entire wandering through the distorted halls had been meaningless. My hand shook as I reached for a key, trying to steady my breathing, but I couldn't find the words to express what I was feeling. The emptiness of the office, combined with the perfect, uncanny order of the keys, felt like a warning, a statement, Or maybe a confession from the building itself. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the keys. Hours, maybe minutes, though it didn't matter because time had lost its shape in that place. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the way out was a cruel, shifting riddle. The parking lot looped endlessly. The road seemed impossibly narrow and dark, and the forest pressed against the edges of my vision, alive in its stillness. I left the motel eventually, my hands gripping the steering wheel as if holding on for dear life. My eyes fixed on the fading neon, hoping beyond reason that the road would straighten and the hills would open. Even now, thinking back on that night, I can still feel the way the hallways seemed to stretch when I tried to follow logic. The almost imperceptible shifts of walls and corners, the uncanny silence punctuated by footsteps that weren't there. I've driven that road since, but I never look for another sign, never trust a flickering neon light on a ridge to guide me. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel the impossible corridors folding back into themselves, the keys lined up as if waiting for me. And I understand, in a way that chills me to the bone, that some places are patient. They wait for the next traveller, and time does not exist there in the way we know it. The memory presses in on me even now, subtle and unrelenting. The motel was not just a building, it was a trap of perception, a quiet and patient intelligence folded into walls and floorboards, so ordinary that it is almost impossible to describe. I've tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it with logic, but the pressure of that memory is unyielding. The hallways, the shifting rooms, the endless parking lot, they haunt me in quiet moments, in a way that isn't terrifying, in flashes, but in the slow, impossible accumulation of unease. And I know that somewhere along that road, the motel still waits, patiently and perfectly, ready for the next person to follow its impossible layout, to lose track of hours, days, or whatever measure of time they bring, and to discover, as I did, that leaving may be as impossible as it feels. Story 4, The Vanishing Guest, Next Door. I first noticed the room next to mine on the second night of my stay at that small, forgotten Blue Ridge Motel. The light behind its curtain burned steadily through the darkness, a pale, flickering rectangle that should have signaled occupancy. But when I asked at the front desk, the clerk gave me a polite, almost knowing smile and said no one had checked in there in weeks. I told myself it was just a neighbour, someone who had forgotten to check out maybe, or a light left on by accident. I went to my room and tried to push the thought from my mind, but the glow was stubborn, bleeding through the crack under my door, painting the hall in sickly, pale light. That night, sleep came fitfully, the kind where every small noise is magnified and every shadow seems deliberate. I thought I heard movement behind the curtain, subtle shifts that made the light sway just enough to catch my eye. I told myself it was imagination, the effect of a long drive and sleepless hours pressing down on me. But when I glanced back toward the room, the shadows seemed to twitch, brief flashes of motion that vanished when I blinked. My pulse would spike, and I would force my gaze away, counting ceiling tiles and trying to make the mundane fill the gaps. Yet even in those moments, a quiet unease settled in my chest, something that pressed against me without sound. Over the next day, I caught myself glancing at that room more often than I intended. Each time I left my own door, whether to visit the vending machine, step outside for a cigarette, or check the lobby, the room seemed closer somehow. I wasn't imagining it. The angles were subtly wrong, the distance felt compressed, and sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I saw a figure reflected in the cracked window glass. A person standing just behind the curtain, though when I looked directly, there was nothing there. It didn't move like a normal person, not the way the clerk or any guest did. It was always still, only present in those half glances that made my stomach knot. By the third night, the quiet tension in the air had thickened. I tried to ignore the lights and the fleeting shadows, but the sense of being watched had grown, subtle at first, now unmistakable. Each creak in the hall, each scraping of a shoe felt amplified, though my neighbours were silent, their doors closed, their rooms empty. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks, willing time to pass faster. I didn't hear anything explicit at first, no voices or knocks, just that constant, unshakable sense of presence, like the room was aware of me in ways that I couldn't explain. Morning came, grey and muted, and I left my room briefly to stretch my legs. When I passed the hallway again, my stomach dropped. The door to the room next to mine was gone. Where the faded wood had once hung, there was only a blank, featureless wall. I stopped, my hand hovering in the air as if touching the space might make it real again. I asked the clerk when I returned to the office, my voice quieter than intended, almost fearful. He smiled, the same polite, knowing smile, and shook his head. There was no explanation, no apology, nothing beyond the simple human gesture that made me feel both dismissed and warned. That day, I tried to rationalize everything. Perhaps it had been a previous guest who had left abruptly, a maintenance error, a trick of the light and fatigue combined, but the memory of the reflections, the light burning behind the curtain, the impossibly still figure, refused to let me go. The hallway itself seemed smaller now, compressed. The space where the door had been seeming to draw me in, even when I told myself it was impossible. Even the other rooms, the bland, ordinary motel rooms, felt somehow wrong, as if the absence of that door had unbalanced everything around it. By nightfall, I didn't sleep. I stayed in my room, the shadows stretching across the walls, listening to the faint hum of the fluorescent lights in the hall. Each time I moved, I thought I saw the flash of a figure at the edge of my vision, just beyond the line of the bed, or reflected faintly in the warped mirror. I convinced myself to look directly once, a brief glance down the hall. Nothing was there, and yet when I turned back to my bed, that same sense of watching pressed against me, suffocating, relentless. It was as if the vanishing room hadn't really gone anywhere at all. The next morning, I checked out earlier than I intended. The clerk was at the desk again, same pale smile. I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't need answers to what I had seen or not seen, because I felt deep in my bones that the explanation would have done me no good. Outside, the air of the mountains was crisp, the sky clear, yet the memory of the room, of the figure that might have existed and might not have, stayed with me like a shadow that refuses to leave. Every bend in the road, every turn of the hills brought it back. That uneasy pressure in my chest, the lingering light behind the non-existent curtain. Even weeks later, long after I returned home, I would see flashes in reflective surfaces, just faint enough to make me question whether it was my imagination. A shadow in a window, a shifting light in a corner of a room. Small things, easily dismissed, yet they carried the weight of memory, pressing in with the same subtle dread I felt in that motel. I've never returned to that stretch of the highway. I can't. The thought of the room next door, the way it vanished as if swallowed by the building, leaves me with the same uneasy certainty I had when I first saw it, that some things exist just beyond comprehension, lingering in the spaces we believe to be empty, watching quietly, waiting for the next traveller to notice. Even now, recounting it, I feel the same prickle of unease along my spine. The memory is vivid, impossibly so. The flicker of light behind the curtain, the brief reflection of a face that did not belong to any living person I know, and the blank wall that replaced it. The motel itself feels alive in memory, patient and unmoving, holding on to that room, holding on to me, pressing into the corners of my perception. And I know, without being able to say why, that somewhere, deep in the ridges of the Blue Ridge, that room still exists in some form, and that it is waiting for the next person to notice the light flickering behind the curtain. Story 5. The Midnight Knock. It was well past midnight when the first knock came. Slow, deliberate, almost thoughtful in its pacing. At first, I thought it was some prank, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in a cheap roadside motel in the middle of nowhere. The fluorescent light above the door flickered as if in hesitation, casting half shadows across the hall, and I told myself it was the wind rattling the metal frame, or maybe a branch scraping against the siding. I pulled the thin comforter tighter around my shoulders, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the knock came again, steady and insistent. It wasn't the kind of noise a branch makes. There was a rhythm to it, deliberate, almost intelligent. And that's when the unease first seeped into my chest, a cold weight that made my fingers tremble. I hesitated before moving toward the peephole, each step measured and slow, the carpet muffling my approach, but not enough to silence my own heartbeat, which suddenly felt loud enough to echo through the empty room. Pressing my eye to the small glass, I saw a figure standing there, tall, unnaturally still, the shape pressed close to the door, faceless in the shadows cast by the flickering hallway light. I tried to call out, my voice cracking in the dead quiet. "Hello? Who's there?" No answer came, just the soft, unchanging rhythm of the knocks. My throat tightened, a lump forming as a shiver ran down my spine, and I couldn't quite tell if I was more afraid of what I'd see if I opened the door or of leaving it closed. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, and the knocks never wavered. I fumbled with the lock, the metal cold and alien under my shaking hands. Finally, I took a breath and swung the door open, half expecting some neighbourly traveller or a lost hiker. The hall was empty, nothing but the faint buzz of the broken fluorescent lights and the stale air of the corridor. My own reflection stared back at me from the small mirror across the hall, wide-eyed and pale. I stepped forward, peering around the corner, and that's when I felt it. A coldness against the back of my neck, like someone had exhaled directly onto my skin. I spun around, but there was no one, not a sound, not a movement. The hallway stretched out before me, empty, yet it felt wrong. I rushed back into my room, locking the door behind me and sliding the deadbolt into place, though I knew it didn't matter. Something about the way the figure had waited, patient and silent, made me feel that the lock would not have stopped them if they had chosen to enter. I sat on the edge of the bed, knees drawn up, ears straining for any sound beyond the soft hum of the air conditioner. At some point, I thought I heard a whisper, faint but urgent, coming from the space beyond the door. I held my breath, telling myself it was the wind again, the hum of the motel settling. Anything but what I feared it might be. Sleep came in fits and starts, each time broken by the memory of the knock, the shadow, the impossible stillness. When I finally drifted, I dreamt of the figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching. When I woke, the room was exactly as I had left it, but the fear lingered like smoke in the corners, curling and settling where I couldn't see. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning, get back on the road, and never look back. The next morning, I loaded my bags into the trunk, still glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that same dark shape leaning against the doorframe or peering from a window. The motel lot was empty except for a few parked cars, their owners likely long gone, and the building itself seemed inert, almost welcoming in the sharp morning light. I started the engine, trying to shake the memory, But then I caught a movement at the edge of the tree line across the street. The figure was there, tall, faceless, watching silently as cars passed by. I slammed the accelerator down, my chest tight, the tires screaming against the asphalt as the distance between us widened. Over the next days, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. A local maybe, someone eccentric who liked to wander at night, or a prankster working the highway motels. I drove back the way I had come, took different routes, even called the local police department, but no one could explain the figure, the knocks, or why I could feel that same cold breath lingering on my skin hours later. I told friends about it, careful to leave out the more disturbing details, but their laughter and disbelief only made the memory sharper, like a bruise that refuses to heal. Weeks passed. Nights were harder than ever. Every creak, every wind-blown branch tapping against the window set my nerves on edge. I started noticing shadows in my peripheral vision, shapes that didn't belong. And though I would blink and shake my head, the feeling of being watched never left. I realized slowly that it wasn't just that motel or that night. It had followed me. The figure waiting at the edge of the tree line was no longer a single memory. It became a pattern, a silent companion in every lonely stretch of road I traveled, always just beyond the light, always patient. I returned once, against my better judgment, to the town where the motel stood. The Blue Ridge Motel was gone, replaced by an empty lot, weeds crawling over the cracked asphalt. No signs, no building, nothing that could account for the experience. I asked around, hoping for a lead, a story, some confirmation that it had been a real place, a real event. The locals shrugged, eyes wary, offering vague tales of travellers who vanished, of strange sightings at night along the highway, of old legends whispered in the hollows. I never found the motel, and yet I can still see the figure, the way it stood, patient and silent, like it had been waiting for me all along. Sometimes, late at night, when I drive down back roads, surrounded by dark forest, I think I catch it at the edge of the tree line, always watching, always still. I've learned not to stop, not to look too long, and never, ever to open the door if I hear a knock in the dead of night. The memory of that night, the cold breath, the steady, deliberate knocking, the impossible stillness of that figure has become part of me, woven into the quiet moments when I'm alone, when the wind rustles through the trees, and when the night stretches too long and the shadows feel alive. I don't know if the motel was ever real, or if it exists in some way I can't understand. I don't know who or what the figure was, or why it waited, but I know that once you've felt its presence, once you've felt the cold brush of breath against your neck when no one is there, you never forget. The fear lingers in ways you can't explain, in places you can't escape, and in moments when you think you're alone. Sometimes, on quiet roads under moonless skies, I still hear the slow, deliberate knock, and I know, even without looking, that the figure is there, watching, waiting. I have learned not to stop, not to question it, and to keep driving, because the moment you do, you might never leave the highway at all. Story 6. The Flickering Fluorescent Horror. I pulled into the Blue Ridge Motel just as the sun was sinking behind the jagged ridges, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges. The place was small, the kind of roadside stop that seemed permanently tired, with a parking lot cracked and uneven, weeds curling up through the asphalt. The sign swung slightly in the breeze, squeaking on its hinges, and I remember thinking how perfect it looked for an overnight stop. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting the lobby in a dull, harsh glow. The clerk, a thin man with a face that seemed too narrow for his skull, barely glanced at me before handing me a key. Room 3, he said, voice flat, eyes wide and unblinking. I tried to ask about Wi-Fi, breakfast hours, anything normal, but he kept staring, his pupils large, too still, as though expecting something from me I couldn't name. I left it alone and trudged down the narrow corridor toward the room. The first thing I noticed when I entered was the flicker. The fluorescent above the bed buzzed so sharply it made my teeth ache, and the light sputtered, dimming in jerky, uneven pulses. At first, I thought it was just the bulb, but as I set my bag down, I caught movement in the corner of the room. A shadow, hunched, crawling just at the edge of the light. I turned sharply. Nothing. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was exhaustion, the way long drives dull the senses and make you see shapes where there are none. I tried to sleep, but the light seemed aware, sputtering faster as though it were breathing. Shadows shifted along the walls with a strange, deliberate intent. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see the tree line or the empty parking lot, but the blinds rattled like fingernails scratching glass, though no wind touched them. Hours, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell, passed in that uneasy half-light. Every time the fluorescent pulsed, the shadows seemed to sharpen. One leaned closer to the bed, slouching over some invisible weight, and I felt its gaze, cold and patient. I wanted to call the clerk, demand another room, anything, but the phone was dead. When I tried to leave, the door gave a soundless protest, like it didn't want me to open it. I wrenched it, heart hammering, and stepped into a hallway that stretched impossibly long, fluorescent lights along the ceiling flickering in rhythm with the room I'd left behind. At the end of the hall, the exit was nowhere to be seen. I walked and walked, each step echoing too sharply, shadows collecting in corners and following me, pooling beneath the ceiling tiles. It was the kind of quiet that isn't quiet, the kind that presses at your chest and makes your own breathing seem loud, wrong. I passed room after room, each door slightly ajar, and sometimes I thought I saw movement inside, figures slumping or standing still, silhouettes that vanished when I looked straight at them. There were no voices, just that persistent, low buzzing from the flickering lights, like a swarm of insects trapped in glass. Every few steps I felt it, the sensation that someone or something was watching me from just out of sight. My skin prickled, and I realized that the shadows weren't random. They were deliberate, like they were reacting to my presence, or maybe my thoughts. Panic began to build, a slow creeping thing, turning my stomach sour. I ran. When I reached what I thought was the front door, the parking lot awaited, or at least the illusion of it. I ran to my car, but it felt as though the lot stretched forever. Every turn brought me back to the same cracked sign swinging gently, the motel's name faintly glowing under the sickly dusk light. I thought I could drive away, but each attempt led me in a circle, the road behind me unraveling into the trees, empty and foreboding. Something waited in the tree line. I was sure of it. I glimpsed movement, tall and still, like a figure just watching, indifferent to my frantic escape. I could hear the fluorescent buzz inside my car, faint, as though it had followed me. I wandered, days, maybe hours. I lost track. I slept briefly on the ground by the side of the building, but the light followed me in every reflection, every window pane, and even then I felt a presence pressing in. At some point, hunger and fear merged into a dull, steady numbness. I stopped trusting the motel's layout, the hallways, the rooms. I stopped trusting my own memory. One moment I thought I saw the clerk behind a curtain in the lobby. The next, he was gone, leaving the keys lined up neatly, as if waiting for me to return. I approached the office slowly, hesitating, my hands trembling. Inside, everything was the same as it had been. The smell of disinfectant and mildew hung in the air. The keys sat perfectly aligned on the counter, polished and still. I called out, my voice raw, hoarse from days of shouting into empty hallways. The clerk didn't appear, and no sound answered me except the low, incessant hum of the fluorescent lights somewhere deep in the building. The feeling of eyes on me didn't leave. I felt them in every reflection, in every corner I turned. I left the office and walked back into the hall, half expecting the walls to shift, the doors to vanish, or the shadows to gather and reach for me. I finally found my room, or at least the space where it should have been. The fluorescent buzzed as always, flickering, outlining that same hunched shape that had never truly left. It moved closer when I looked away, only to vanish when I tried to see it directly. My bag was gone, though I hadn't moved it. The door refused to latch properly, swinging gently with a mockery of the wind outside. I leaned against the wall, hands pressed to the peeling paint, and tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, a hallucination born from isolation and a long drive through winding mountain roads. But I couldn't shake it. The motel seemed alive with patience, waiting to see how long I would last. I finally left, forcing myself into the parking lot, but even then the sense of being watched clung to me. I drove away as fast as I could, the mountains stretching endlessly on either side. Yet every glance in the rearview mirror gave me glimpses of movement, figures at the edge of the trees, shadows dancing along the road, the motel's sign swinging faintly in the distance like a heartbeat. Days later, I dream of it still, the flickering light, the shifting hallways, and the silent presence that knows when I want to leave and doesn't care. I can't say how long I was there, and I can't be sure I ever really left. Some nights I wake, heart hammering, and think I hear that low buzz again, coming from somewhere just out of reach, waiting, and I know that if I returned, the motel would be the same, patient and hungry for the hours I thought I'd lost. Story 7, The Whispering Linoleum. I remember checking into that little roadside motel just as the Appalachian dusk was settling like a wet blanket over the hills. The sun had sunk behind the ridges, leaving the air thick with the smell of pine and damp earth and the kind of silence that feels alive if you pay attention. The clerk at the front desk was a quiet man, his eyes flicking up from a notebook only when I handed him my ID. He gave me the key to room 7 with a small, tight-lipped smile and a nod that didn't feel entirely welcoming, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The building itself was tired, wood siding weathered and chipped, the neon sign out front sputtering weakly. I carried my bag down the narrow hallway, the old floorboards groaning under my steps, and tried to ignore the way the shadows pooled thickly in the corners, almost moving in the periphery of my vision. The first thing I noticed inside the room was the linoleum. It wasn't particularly worn or damaged, but there were these dark streaks running through it that caught the light oddly. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the flickering overhead bulb, but the more I stared, the more those streaks seemed to shift, curling and stretching when I looked away. I shrugged it off, blaming exhaustion from the long drive, but an uneasy feeling settled in my chest anyway. The motel smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't name, something faintly sweet but sour at the same time, like rotting syrup. That night, as I lay in the thin, lumpy mattress of the bed, the whispers began. At first, I assumed it was the building settling or maybe mice scratching beneath the floorboards, but these sounds weren't random. They were deliberate, soft but insistent, the kind of murmurs that make you strain to understand them even when you know they might not make sense. I held my breath listening. There were words, or at least syllables, a kind of half-formed pleading that tickled at the edges of my hearing. I told myself it was exhaustion, that the road and the dark hills outside had frayed my nerves. Still, every time I thought I could ignore it, the words came back, louder this time, curling beneath the floor like something trying to get closer to me. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, Every subtle groan from the ceiling above made me flinch. I kept imagining shapes moving beneath the linoleum, hunched and pressing against it like they wanted to get out. I even lifted the rug that covered part of the floor, thinking maybe there was a hidden hole, maybe a rat infestation, but there was nothing. The wood underneath was solid, just as it should be. Still, the sensation of being watched, of someone or something moving just out of sight, never left me. When I walked across the room, I swore the linoleum shifted beneath my feet, as if it were alive, breathing and contracting. By the second night, I was nearly catatonic with fear. I didn't turn on the lights. The harsh glow made the shadows stretch and twist unnaturally. Instead, I left the small lamp on, hoping its weak circle of light would make the whispers less pronounced. It didn't. If anything, the shadows seemed to lean closer to the edges of that light, pressing against it, as though curious about me. I tried to reason with myself. I told myself it was all nerves, that the isolation of the road, the dark hills outside, and the smell of the old motel were doing strange things to my mind. But then came the movement, a subtle, almost imperceptible crawling, like nails dragged across the underside of the floor. I froze, heart hammering, every muscle taut. The whispers grew urgent, pleading. My stomach churned as I realized the words were in English, though broken and indistinct. "Don't leave," they said. "Stay here." I couldn't stay. I packed my bag in a panic, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped my toothbrush and almost my wallet. Each time I touched the door, I felt the floor shift beneath me, like the room itself was aware of my movements, aware I wanted to escape. When I finally opened the door, the hallway stretched impossibly long, longer than it had before. The fluorescent lights flickered in erratic pulses, casting long, lurching shadows that twisted along the peeling wallpaper. I stepped into the hall cautiously, glancing over my shoulder at the room. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape crouched by the far corner, watching. Then it was gone. I ran down the hall, each footstep echoing loudly in the emptiness. Outside, the lot was empty, the air sharp with the chill of early morning. I didn't pause to look back, but I swear I could hear the soft whispers following me, carried in the wind, curling through the cracks beneath the door of room 7. I got into my car and drove without stopping until the motel was nothing more than a distant blur behind me, yet the whispers never fully left my mind. Even days later, I found myself haunted by the memory. I went back once to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it, but the motel was gone. In its place was an overgrown patch of land, weeds and briars curling up where the asphalt had been, the air still thick with the scent of mildew and old pine. I asked a local at the gas station about it, and he just shook his head, muttering something about the hills, swallowing up old buildings, how the forest likes to hide things. But I knew what I had experienced wasn't the forest. It was the room itself, alive in some way I couldn't explain. Even now, I sometimes dream about it. The linoleum shifts beneath me in my sleep, and the whispers scrape against my eardrums, low and insistent. I can feel them under the floor, just out of reach, calling me back, asking me to stay. I try to tell myself it was exhaustion, stress, a trick of the mind, but the memory of that cold, still presence beneath the linoleum is too vivid. The road, the hills, the lonely motel, they all seem to echo with the same quiet dread I felt that night. I don't speak of it much. Most people would think I'm exaggerating, or worse, imagining things. But sometimes, driving late through the mountains, when the forest presses close and the air is heavy with moisture and rot, I swear I hear the faintest whisper from beneath the asphalt, calling me home. I left the region entirely after that, swearing never to stay in another roadside cabin or motel along those winding Appalachian roads. But even now, when I close my eyes, the dark streaks in the linoleum appear before me, the shifting, curling lines, the movement underfoot, and the whispers, soft, patient, pleading. They've become a part of me, these sounds that should not exist. I can't explain why they were there or what they wanted, but I will never forget the sensation of being watched from beneath a floor that should have been solid, the oppressive awareness that someone or something had been waiting for me, and I fear sometimes that it is still waiting beneath the floors of some forgotten roadside cabin for the next traveller foolish enough to step inside. Story 8, The Room with the Broken Mirror. I remember the first night I saw the mirror in that motel room, though I wish I could forget it. It was the kind of cheap roadside place you find tucked into a forgotten stretch of highway in the Appalachian foothills, where the paint peels from the walls and the smell of mildew clings to the air. The mirror hung above the dresser, its silvering fractured with jagged cracks that spread like lightning over the glass. At first, I thought little of it. Mirrors get scratched. Accidents happen. But the more I looked, the more wrong it felt. It didn't just reflect the room. It reflected something else. Something that didn't belong. The edges of the glass seemed darker than they should have been, like they absorbed the dim fluorescent light overhead, and sometimes the reflections were off. A movement where there should have been none. A shadow that lingered too long. The first time I noticed it, I caught the corner of my eye, a slight shift near the doorway. I turned fully, and nothing was there, just the peeling wallpaper and the rusted heater vent. But the mirror held onto it, showing a shape crouched in the corner, hunched low, its features blurred but distinctly human. I told myself I was tired. I'd driven all day along winding mountain roads, the sun sinking behind the ridges, the mist rolling in thick from the hollows. Sleep deprivation plays tricks on your eyes. Yet when I moved closer, the figure vanished. The room was empty. Only the mirror remained, fractured and accusing. That night I tried to sleep with the lights on. The buzzing of the fluorescent fixture above hummed against my skull. A monotonous, oppressive presence. I closed my eyes, but the movements in the mirror didn't stop. Sometimes I'd catch a flicker, a shadow crossing behind the reflection of the dresser, a glint of white that might have been a face. Each time I turned toward the sound, I found nothing. I thought about calling the front desk, but the clerk had been distant, muttering my reservation into the phone like he wanted me gone before the night fully settled. So I lay in bed, heart hammering, staring into the fractured glass, feeling eyes that were not my own, tracking me from impossible angles. By the second night, I had begun to notice the details. The mirror didn't just lie, it hinted. A foot at the edge of the reflection where no foot belonged, a hand brushing against the corner of the bed, vanishing the instant I tried to focus on it. I started to speak aloud to myself, rationalizing the illusions, old wiring, warped glass, shadows cast wrong by the single overhead light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just tricks of the eye. There was something deliberate, something watching and waiting. I could feel it in the air, a low pressure that pressed against my chest and made each breath shallow, in the way mountain air gets thick and still before a storm. I tried not to look at the mirror, keeping my back turned when possible, but the glass demanded attention. I would wake in the middle of the night, heart leaping, to see a new distortion, an impossible angle where the room extended farther than it should. Once I swore I saw someone sitting at the foot of my bed, hunched and silent. I spun around, fists clenched, light burning my eyes, and the room was empty. But when I dared to glance back at the mirror, the shape had vanished. yet it lingered in the edges of my vision, stitched into the fractures in the glass. On the third night I attempted to leave. My bag was packed, keys in hand. I opened the door, peered into the dim hallway, and for a moment thought I was free. But as I moved down the narrow corridor, I noticed how the walls seemed to stretch, how the shadows thickened with every step, as if the motel itself were reshaping to trap me inside. I turned back to the room, only to see in the mirror not my own reflection, but the figure again, crouched and patient, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Panic hit me like a cold wave, and I bolted from the building without turning back. I didn't stop until my car's headlights splashed over the road ahead, the dark hills swallowing the motel behind me. Even months later, the memory hasn't faded. I dream of that mirror, the fractures glowing faintly in the dark, the impossible spaces that seem to stretch beyond the walls. Sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I still see the shape, hunched and silent, waiting at the edge of perception. I've tried to tell myself it was stress, the isolation of the road, the loneliness of traveling through the mountains at night, but I know better. There is a weight in those cracks, a knowledge that someone, or something, was observing me, tracing my movements, and perhaps following me even now. I avoid mirrors whenever possible, especially broken ones, but even in ordinary reflections, I catch glimpses, fleeting and subtle, that make my stomach tighten. A shadow that doesn't match my own, a distortion in the light, the sense of being watched from angles that shouldn't exist. I can't explain it, and I've learned not to try. There are places and moments in these hills where the ordinary bends into something ungraspable, where the isolation presses in until you start to notice the corners of the world moving when they shouldn't. That motel room was one such place. The cracked mirror wasn't just glass, it was a doorway to something patient, deliberate, and unseen. I sometimes think about returning to see if the figure is still there, if the motel still shifts around impossibly, if the mirror waits with the same silent insistence. But I cannot. Even imagining myself back there, standing in that fluorescent light, the edges of the reflection crawling with possibilities, makes my skin crawl. So instead I live with the memory, a lingering terror that doesn't end, a shadow stitched into the fabric of my recollection. The mountains themselves feel emptier for it, and yet in the quiet moments, I swear I still feel that same weight of eyes on me, watching from fractured angles, patient and unyielding, waiting for me to slip just a little too far from reason. The broken mirror doesn't rest. It follows me. I cannot close my eyes without seeing it, cannot walk past a reflective surface without wondering if the figure has shifted to sit behind me, crouched and quiet. Some nights, I imagine hearing the soft scrape of nails against fractured glass, the faintest whisper of movement, and I cannot tell if it is the memory or something still watching, lingering in the spaces between reflection and reality. And though the months have passed, the terror has not lessened. It is a quiet, enduring fear, one that lives not in sudden jolts, but in the endless, patient knowledge that the mirror, the figure, and that impossible room exist somewhere beyond what I can touch, beyond what I can escape, waiting. Story 9, the highway that led back. I still remember the first time I realised the highway wasn't what it seemed. I had checked out of that old peeling motel early in the morning, desperate to be gone before the sun rose fully. But as soon as I turned onto the main road, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. The asphalt stretched ahead, straight at first, lined with the familiar Virginia pines and the occasional run-down billboard for a diner or a gas station. I drove for what felt like minutes, yet something was off. The signs I passed seemed oddly familiar, though I had never been on this stretch before, or so I told myself. A gnawing feeling in my stomach said otherwise. As I rounded the first curve, I caught sight of the neon vacancy sign from the motel glowing faintly in the distance. I squinted, thinking it was a trick of the light. Maybe the road just curved oddly. I shook my head and pressed the accelerator harder, expecting to leave it behind in seconds. But then the trees seemed to lean in closer, their trunks black and skeletal against the pale sky, blotting out the sunlight, and the road curved again, bringing me right back to where I started. Panic rose in me, slow and cold. I checked my mirrors. No cars, no people, nothing but the endless line of trees and that damned road. I tried a different route, hoping to find a side road, a highway sign pointing east or west, anything that could free me. Every turn I made seemed to loop back, familiar landmarks reappearing with uncanny precision. The same broken fence, the same rusted mailbox, even the same scrape of a branch against a power line. Hours or maybe minutes passed. I couldn't tell. My watch had stopped at some point, and the sky seemed to darken unnaturally, the clouds pressing low, heavy and grey, though the morning had just begun when I left. I told myself it was exhaustion, that maybe I had slept too long at that motel, that my mind was playing tricks after a week of isolation in the Blue Ridge Hills. But the sensation of being watched, of the road itself conspiring to trap me, wouldn't leave. At one point, I saw movement at the edge of the forest, a flicker of something human, or almost human, darting between the trees. I slammed my foot on the brakes, but the figure was gone before I could make sense of it. Maybe a deer, I reasoned, or a hunter, yet the shadows seemed heavier, more deliberate, as if the trees themselves were aware of me, their gnarled branches reaching toward the asphalt like skeletal fingers. My hands shook on the wheel, and I realized I hadn't seen a single other car for miles. The highway wasn't just deserted, it was unnatural. By the time I reached what looked like an intersection, I thought I had found salvation. A small sign pointed to a town several miles ahead, and I turned, praying for a diner, a gas station, anything with another soul. The road stretched into a narrow ribbon of asphalt, and the hills rose on all one either side. At first, everything seemed normal. Then the sign repeated itself, almost mockingly, a second one showing the exact same mileage. A third appeared just ahead. My stomach dropped. I slammed the brakes again, heart hammering, and realized I had seen this exact stretch of road 3 turns ago. Each mile marker, each bend, each distant silhouette of a tree returned with eerie fidelity, mocking my efforts to leave. I tried to keep calm, reciting the old survival techniques I'd learned from hiking alone in the mountains. Follow a stream, trust the sun, use landmarks, but every stream I saw looped back to itself. Every ridge I climbed seemed to drop me back at the same hollow, and the sun's position was wrong, sluggish, like it didn't want to let me escape the oppressive grey of that morning. My eyes ached from constant scanning, from trying to read the subtle shifts in the road. But the road was relentless, patient, waiting for me to falter. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed. I couldn't tell if it was still morning or if the sky had fully darkened, though there was no sense of true night. The road twisted again, and there it was, the neon vacancy sign, flickering like a beacon in the fog, just as I had seen it when I first arrived. I froze, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles hurt. My mind screamed that I had left this place, that I had escaped, yet here it was again, looming in the distance. My stomach churned. I realized then that the motel had never been a destination. It had been a trap, a lure. Something about this place didn't want me gone. I didn't think. I turned the wheel sharply, trying to drive through the hills, through the forest, through anything to break the pattern. I stayed on the road, following the curves blindly, hoping fatigue would somehow shift reality back to something normal. But the signs repeated. The same hollow appeared, the same branches scratched against the car, as if the forest itself had grown impatient with my attempts to escape. I heard nothing but the wind, a faint scrape here and there, and the echo of something that might have been my own breathing, or might have been the whisper of the highway itself. The longer I drove, the more the hills seemed to watch me, pressing in closer, until the road became a narrow corridor lined with shadowed pines, black against the grey sky. Every time I turned a corner, I saw the faint outline of the motel's sign just ahead, and I slammed the brakes, tears blurring my vision. I tried to memorize each twist, each tree, each mile marker, but the road betrayed me. It was patient, deliberate, and it had no intention of letting me leave. My chest burned with panic, and my hands shook uncontrollably. I started muttering to myself, trying to ground my mind, repeating the names of towns, of rivers, of anything real. But each word felt hollow, swallowed by the oppressive air that pressed in from the hills. Finally, I drove until the neon lights disappeared behind a bend, a faint glimmer swallowed by the endless hills, and I dared to breathe. The sky was still grey, but the road seemed normal once more. I didn't stop, didn't slow, just kept moving, following the twists of the Blue Ridge as if the mountains themselves might offer some mercy. Even then, though, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, a presence just beyond the reach of my headlights, moving with me in perfect, silent harmony. Every shadow at the tree line, every brush of wind against the car felt deliberate, like it was testing me, measuring me. When I finally reached a small town hours later, I parked at a gas station, shaking, drenched in sweat, unable to speak. The attendant gave me a curious glance, probably thinking I was just another tired traveller. I didn't care. I filled the tank, bought a soda I couldn't taste, and left as quickly as possible. But even days later, in the quiet hours of the night, I dream of that highway, the one that curls back on itself, the one that traps you with patience and silence. I see the motel sign glowing faintly in the fog. I hear the scrape of branches against metal, and I feel the same eyes, unseen but unrelenting, tracing my every movement. I have told people the story, but they dismiss it. Say I was tired, say it was stress, but I know what I experienced. That road waits for the unwary, and somewhere just beyond a bend, it waits for me again.